Investigators this morning say newly found debris almost certainly comes from the missing Malaysian jetliner. One of the two pieces is apparently from the outside of the plane, the second from the inside.
It was a quiet morning on the island of Réunion, a small dot in the Indian Ocean where nothing unusual ever happens. A man cleaning the beach noticed something stuck in the sand, a long, twisted piece of metal, heavy and covered in barnacles. At first, he thought it was trash from the sea, but within hours, investigators confirmed it was part of Malaysia Airlines, Flight 370, the jet that vanished without a trace more than 500 days earlier. For the first time since that night in 2014, the world had a real clue. Yet as scientists examined the fragment, they realized it wasn't just wreckage. The barnacles clinging to its surface carried a hidden timeline, one that didn't make sense. If this piece had drifted naturally, it should have taken a predictable path across the ocean. Instead, it seemed to move against the wind, crossing thousands of miles before arriving here. The ocean had spoken, but its story didn't fit. And as experts struggled to explain the impossible journey, one old suspicion returned. Inside the home of Captain Zaharie Ahmad Shah, investigators had once found a flight simulator tracing nearly the same path MH370 took before vanishing. Now, with this fragment resurfacing under impossible odds, that simulation felt less like coincidence and more like a plan. On March 8, 2014, Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 took off from Kuala Lumpur, bound for Beijing. It was a routine red-eye flight with 239 people on board: families, students, and business travelers. For the first 38 minutes, everything looked normal. Then, without warning, the plane vanished from civilian radar. No distress call, no emergency code, just silence. Military radar later picked up the aircraft making a strange turn, looping back across the Malay Peninsula before heading south into the vast emptiness of the Indian Ocean. It was as if someone had taken control and erased the flight from the map. Investigators began to focus on the Captain Zaharie Ahmad Shah, a veteran pilot with over 18,000 flight hours. Inside his home, police found something unsettling: a flight simulator showing a route almost identical to the one MH370 appeared to have taken before disappearing. To many, it looked like a suicide mission carefully rehearsed in secret, but Malaysia's official report stopped short of saying that. It ended with one haunting word: inconclusive. The world was left suspended between theories and hope, clinging to the possibility that maybe, somewhere, wreckage would appear. And when it finally did, it only deepened the mystery. It was July 29, 2015, more than a year since MH370 disappeared. On the quiet shores of Réunion Island, a man named Johnny Begg was starting another day of beach cleaning. The tide had just pulled back when something large caught his eye: a curved metallic object tangled in seaweed. It looked nothing like the usual debris that washed up after storms. It was heavy, about 2 meters long, and its edges were torn as if ripped apart by tremendous force. The surface was covered in barnacles and salt stains, but beneath the grime, you could still see the unmistakable color of aircraft paint. Johnny called the local police, and soon the beach filled with curious onlookers and reporters. No one knew it yet, but they were standing in front of one of the most significant aviation discoveries of the decade. Within days, aviation experts arrived from France and Malaysia. They quickly realized this was not just a random piece of metal. The part was identified as a flaperon, a section of the wing used to control lift and balance during takeoff and landing. When technicians compared the serial number to Boeing's records, the match was undeniable. It belonged to a Boeing 777, the exact model flown by Malaysia Airlines Flight 370. For the first time, investigators could point to something real. After 16 months of searching thousands of miles of open ocean, this was the first piece of physical evidence that MH370 had indeed gone down. The news spread like wildfire. Families of passengers cried tears of relief and pain at once. Governments held press conferences. Search operations shifted direction toward the Indian Ocean. Everyone believed the mystery was finally about to end. But as the debris was taken to a laboratory in Toulouse, France, new questions started forming. The flaperon's condition didn't match what many had expected from a plane that had been in the water for over a year. It was remarkably intact, no severe corrosion, no signs of long-term exposure to deep-sea pressure. Even stranger, it carried life. Clinging to its surface were hundreds of small marine creatures, barnacles. They formed thick clusters along the edges, some alive, others fossilized. To most, they were just sea pests, but to marine scientists, they were potential witnesses. Every barnacle grows layer by layer, capturing in its shell the temperature and chemistry of the water it lives in. That meant these creatures could reveal where the flaperon had traveled, how long it had been drifting, and which currents had carried it across the Indian Ocean. At first, the discovery seemed like a breakthrough. Forensic oceanographers believed they could finally trace the object's path back to the crash site. The barnacles were like tiny time capsules, preserving the flaperon's secret journey. But then, something didn't fit. When researchers measured the size and age of the barnacles, the timeline collapsed. If the plane had crashed in March 2014, these creatures would have been growing for over a year. Yet, the samples taken from the flaperon were much younger, some only a few months old. That meant the flaperon hadn't been floating freely in the ocean since the crash. It had been somewhere else stationary, hidden or trapped before it began its final drift toward Réunion. Suddenly, the narrative shifted from discovery to doubt. Had the ocean carried the flaperon naturally, or had it been placed there deliberately, released into the current long after the crash to mislead investigators?
But still, not one piece has been picked up, and the weather is not cooperating.
Satellite data, ocean drift models, and even the Australian-led search zone all relied on the assumption that debris began drifting immediately after impact. If that assumption was wrong, then every calculation that followed could also be wrong. What started as a miracle find was turning into another riddle. The world had waited 16 months for a sign from MH370, and when it finally came, it raised more questions than answers. Somewhere between the waves, a story was still missing, one that began not in the sky, but beneath the surface, in the silent, shifting world of the sea. And the tiny barnacles clinging to that lonely piece of metal seemed to be the only ones who knew the truth. Inside the lab in Toulouse, scientists placed the flaperon under bright white lights, but instead of the metal, their eyes were drawn to what was growing on it. Tiny white shells covered the surface like armor. They were barnacled sea creatures that attach themselves to anything that drifts. These were small, fragile, and yet they carried the timeline of a global mystery. Each barnacle grows in layers, recording the world around it. The temperature, the salinity, even the water's movement becomes part of its shell. To marine biologists, they were like living black boxes, silent, but full of truth. As experts examined the shells, they began peeling back time itself. Using isotope testing, they could determine where each barnacle had lived and for how long. If the flaperon had been floating since March 2014, then the barnacles should have been more than a year old. But they weren't.
That I needed to go do what I could to solve this.
Most were barely 3 or 4 months old, far too young to have been adrift since the crash. It meant the flaperon hadn't been freely drifting all that time. It must have been still somewhere, hidden from the open ocean before being released. That single detail changed everything. Ocean currents in the Indian Ocean are strong and consistent. Debris from a crash should have reached the coast of Africa within months. Yet this piece took 16. Something about its path didn't make sense.
It's very hard to trace back to exactly where it crashed.
Even more confusing, the barnacles grew on parts of the flaperon that should have been above water. If it had floated normally, those surfaces would have stayed dry. That meant the piece might not have been floating flat at all. It could have been weighed down, trapped, or kept in an unnatural position underwater. Suddenly, the discovery that was supposed to solve the mystery started to break it apart. Scientists from France and Australia compared notes, searching for any logical explanation. Some said the flaperon might have been caught in an eddy, a slow-moving whirlpool that could hold it for months. Others wondered if it had been stuck near a coast or inside a lagoon before being set free. But none of those theories matched perfectly. The patterns of growth, the shape of the clusters, even the mix of species on the flaperon all hinted at something else, something that didn't fit the natural rhythm of the sea. It was as if the flaperon had spent part of its life somewhere warm and still, far from the cold southern waters where MH370 was believed to have gone down. For investigators, this was a nightmare. The entire Australian-led search effort had been based on computer models showing where debris should drift from the crash zone. Those models assumed the plane fell somewhere along a narrow arc deep in the southern Indian Ocean. But if the barnacles were right, that theory could be completely wrong. The flaperon had become both a clue and a contradiction. It proved that MH370 had ended in the ocean, but it also whispered that the ocean might not be telling the whole truth. As the evidence piled up, one question grew louder than all the rest. If the flaperon didn't float there on its own, then who or what made sure it did? And somewhere out there, beneath the rolling waves, the rest of the wreckage remained silent. The barnacles had remembered part of the journey, but not the beginning. The answer was still hidden in the water, waiting for those willing to listen to what the sea had been trying to say all along. When the French team completed their first ocean drift experiments, the results immediately challenged everything the world thought it knew about MH370. They built replicas of the flaperon using the same materials and dimensions, then set them afloat in the Indian Ocean under controlled conditions. The goal was simple: to see how such an object would move across the water, how deep it would sink, and how barnacles might grow on its surface. What they discovered was astonishing. The tests showed that a real flaperon would float high above the surface, almost like a raft. Most of its upper side would stay dry, constantly exposed to sunlight and air. That meant barnacles, which can only survive underwater, should have formed only on the lower half. But the actual flaperon from Réunion told a completely different story. It was covered with marine life across every side, even the surfaces that should have remained dry. The growth patterns showed that these creatures had spent months fully submerged in water. That detail alone made the official timeline almost impossible. How could a piece that naturally floats high have stayed underwater long enough for full barnacle growth? Something didn't add up. Oceanographers began running simulations using global current maps and wind data. The ocean they found would have pushed a floating flaperon from the crash zone toward Réunion in roughly 6 to 9 months. Yet the barnacles told a story that started far later, as if the flaperon had been waiting somewhere before beginning its drift. That somewhere became the next great mystery. If it wasn't moving freely for over a year, where had it been? One theory suggested that the flaperon might have become trapped in a calm inlet or harbor, where it floated motionless for months. Another hinted it could have been caught in a fishing net, hauled aboard, and later tossed back into the ocean without anyone realizing what it was. But a darker possibility began to circulate among independent researchers. What if the flaperon hadn't been lost and found by accident at all? What if it had been kept intentionally held back, then released when the world least expected it? There was no proof, but the evidence of the drift itself made many wonder. The matted barnacle growth, the late formation period, and the full submersion all pointed to a strange truth. This object did not behave like natural debris. Meanwhile, the Australian Transport Safety Bureau, which led the search for MH370, faced growing criticism. Their search had already cost over $150 million and mapped an area of the ocean the size of the United Kingdom. Every inch of that operation was based on mathematical drift models. If the flaperon's journey didn't match those models, then the search zone might have been thousands of miles off. The discovery hit like a wave. For months, officials defended their data, insisting the aircraft must have gone down somewhere along the 7th arc, the region determined by satellite handshakes with the missing plane. But the flapper on the one real piece of evidence refused to follow their equations. And so, a new theory took shape. Maybe the flaperon had been trapped in the still waters near Madagascar, shielded from strong currents, and then carried west only after a seasonal change. If true, that would mean the final crash site was far north of the official search zone and that millions had been spent searching the wrong part of the ocean. But the ocean does not lie easily. Even as more drift experiments were performed, none could fully reproduce what had happened. Every test flaperon floated higher, moved faster, and accumulated marine life in different ways. The real one remained an anomaly, a relic that refused to behave by the laws of nature. By the end of 2016, the Australian search team quietly scaled down operations, citing no credible new evidence. Officially, the flaperon proved that MH370 had ended in the Indian Ocean, but unofficially, it had shattered the very logic that led investigators there in the first place. The sea had given back a piece of the truth, but only enough to remind humanity how much remained buried. And for those who looked closer, the question that lingered was the same one haunting every investigator since. If the flaperon did not drift there naturally, who or what wanted it to be found? Until that question is answered, the mystery of MH370 remains suspended somewhere between fact and the impossible. By late 2016, the flaperon had already become one of the most studied fragments in aviation history, but the deeper scientists looked, the stranger its story became. French oceanographers decided to push the investigation further. They weren't satisfied with theories about nets or harbors. They wanted proof of something the sea itself could tell them. Inside a lab in Brittany, a small team began analyzing the chemical makeup of the barnacles that had lived on the flaperon. Each layer of their shells held traces of oxygen isotopes, tiny fingerprints left by the water they grew in. By studying those isotopes, scientists could estimate the temperature of the water and therefore where in the ocean the barnacles had spent their lives. The results stunned everyone. The barnacles had grown in water far warmer than the southern Indian Ocean, where MH370 was believed to have crashed. The temperature readings averaged around 27 degrees Celsius, typical of tropical zones near Madagascar, not the cold, stormy waters southwest of Australia. If the readings were correct, then the flaperon couldn't have come from the official crash site. It must have spent time in a completely different part of the ocean. That revelation cracked the case wide open. For over 2 years, Australia's search operation had focused on a narrow arc based on satellite pings the 7th arc, but the new data suggested something was off. Either the calculations were wrong or the plane's final location had been misinterpreted from the start. The team in Brittany presented their findings quietly. Official agencies didn't rush to comment. Behind closed doors, international investigators debated what to do with the new information. If they accepted it, it would mean admitting that the world had been looking in the wrong place after spending hundreds of millions of dollars and years of effort. Meanwhile, independent scientists began testing their own theories. Some believed the flaperon had drifted north from a crash site closer to the equator. Others thought the piece might have been carried by countercurrent natural but rare oceanic flows that move opposite to the main direction. But even those possibilities couldn't explain everything. Satellite data, barnacle chemistry, and drift simulations all contradicted one another. The deeper investigators dug, the more it seemed as if the ocean itself was hiding something, a story rewritten by time, water, and pressure. One researcher compared it to decoding a secret message written in a language that keeps changing. Every layer of barnacle, every salt crystal, every mark on the metal seemed to whisper different answers. Still, one pattern remained impossible to ignore. The chemical traces from the barnacles matched perfectly with waters near the Mozambique Channel, thousands of miles away from the official search zone. That area, filled with warm eddies and complex currents, had rarely been studied during the initial investigation, but satellite drift models later confirmed that debris from that region could, in theory, reach Réunion at exactly the time the flaperon appeared. If true, it would mean MH370 did not crash in the far south at all. It may have gone down closer to the African coast, a revelation that would overturn every official report released so far. Yet, no government moved to reopen the search. France, which had custody of the flaperon, said the forensic phase was ongoing. Australia ended its mission quietly. Malaysia remained silent. The truth seemed to be trapped between national pride and scientific doubt. And so the flaperon remained a messenger without a voice, its surface coated with information that few seemed willing to interpret. The warm water evidence hinted at a different origin, a different ending, and possibly a different story altogether. By the time the French laboratory completed its final round of tests, most of the world had already moved on. The headlines had faded, the search ships were gone, and only a handful of researchers were still following the trail of the flaperon. Yet inside a sealed room in Toulouse, the story was far from over. Rows of glass containers lined the lab tables, each holding preserved samples of barnacles collected from the wreckage. They were carefully labeled by size, by position, by layer of growth. The largest ones, those that could reveal the most about the flaperon's hidden journey, were kept under lock and key. Only a few government scientists had access to them. When independent experts requested permission to analyze those barnacles, the French authorities refused. Their explanation was simple: the forensic phase was not yet complete. That phrase would become a wall that no one could climb. Months turned into years, and the data remained sealed. Reports circulated that some results had been classified due to international sensitivity. To many observers, it sounded less like science and more like politics. Because if the new evidence pointed toward a different crash location, it could expose serious failures in how the investigation had been handled and who might have wanted certain details buried. Inside the aviation community, whispers began to grow louder. Why was France holding on to the samples when Malaysia, as the country of origin, should have been leading the analysis? And why were oceanographic findings from independent universities suddenly excluded from official reports? No one had clear answers. But what did surface publicly painted a troubling picture. According to a leak published by a French news outlet in 2018, the unreleased barnacle samples had shown distinct layers that didn't match any known drift timeline. Some of the oldest shells appeared to have grown in water closer to the African coast, while others formed later, much farther east. That meant the flaperon had traveled through multiple zones with completely different environments, something that no natural current could explain. If true, the implications were huge. It would mean that parts of the investigation had been based on data that no longer made sense, and that someone, somewhere, had chosen not to share that information with the world. Meanwhile, families of the 239 passengers continued to demand transparency. They had been promised closure, but what they received instead was silence. In 2019, a group of victims' relatives filed an official petition urging France to release the full results of the flaperon study. The response came months later, short and cold, pending further verification. Nothing more. To this day, those samples remain in government custody. The secrecy has fueled endless theories. Some believe it was an attempt to avoid diplomatic conflict between Malaysia, France, and Australia. Others think it's because the findings contradicted international agreements made during the search agreements that defined where the plane was allowed to have crashed. Whatever the reason, the effect is the same. The truth about the flaperon's journey remains locked away, as if it were too inconvenient to confront. Every new request for access has been met with the same phrase, "not ready for release." Even scientists who helped collect the barnacles say they were never allowed to see the final isotopic data. It's as if the ocean spoke clearly, but someone decided the world shouldn't hear what it said. For many, the mystery of MH370 is no longer just about a missing plane. It's about missing answers about evidence that exists but has been silenced. And as time passes, the secrecy becomes its own kind of message. Because after more than a decade, the story of MH370 isn't just written in ocean currents or chemical signatures, it's written in what's being withheld, in the locked drawers of laboratories, in files stamped confidential. Somewhere in those samples, the real path of the flaperon is waiting for a path that could reveal not only where MH370 ended, but how much truth has been kept beneath the surface. Until that evidence is finally released, the ocean will continue to carry the blame for mysteries that might already have answers. And the silence from those who know more will echo louder than the waves themselves. 10 years have passed, yet the mystery of MH370 still hangs over the world like a shadow. The ocean has given back fragments, pieces of metal, shells, and silence, but never the full truth. Each discovery brings answers wrapped in new questions, as if the sea itself refuses to let go of its secret. Maybe the plane lies somewhere we never thought to look. Maybe the data we trusted was never complete. Whatever the truth is, it waits beneath the waves in a graveyard too deep for light to reach. And until every locked file is opened, until every clue is revealed, the Indian Ocean will remain both witness and warden, holding the story of MH370 in its endless quiet depths. Because the sea forgets nothing.